Ciao e bentornati. Welcome back to Pillole D'Italiano. Today, as you can see, it's a different location. It's a different type of episode. I am going to interview William Giovinazzo, the award-winning author of the book Italianità, The Essence of Being Italian, a book that I recently finished reading and I truly loved. Hopefully, this conversation that I'm going to have with William will pique your curiosity, and who knows, maybe you will end up buying the book, and if you are Italian like me or Italian American like him, you will end up discovering more about your origin. Ciao!
Ciao! How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. What about you?
I am doing very well. I'm doing very well.
Well, thank you so much for being here and for your time. I just wanted to put this out there. It's very generous of you to, feel willing to be here.
No. Thank you. I'm so complimented. I'm a big fan of yours, and I mean that sincerely.
I really appreciate, and I'm a fan of yours too. After
Thank
reading this book, already when we connected, I had the feeling that you had so much to say. And then when I finally was able to get your book and go through it, I kid you not, I took like 5 pages of notes.
Well, you know what? That's so great. I tell you what, whenever an Italian, a true Italian, as opposed to an Italian American, reads my book, I'm very anxious. I feel a lot of anxiety because it's like, what did I get wrong? What are they going to read? Going, oh no, what are you talking about? You don't know what you're talking about. So I always worry about that whenever someone who's Italian reads my book. But I'm glad you liked it.
To be honest, I learned so much. So I need to thank you. Absolutely. You have this beautiful way of connecting all the dots and explaining the history behind why we're doing things a certain way, that even being born and bred in Italy, I didn't necessarily know something. So I definitely learned a lot. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That makes me feel so good.
I'm happy.
Great.
If you're asking for like critique, the only thing that I made a note of, well, you're talking in your book about the language and the Italian American pidgin, which is of course something that it's different from what I'm used to.
Sure.
So I was definitely trusting you to know exactly how those words are used. And I remember putting a couple of asterisks next to a few words such as, we use this differently in Italy.
Do you recall any of them?
So Goomba.
Oh, okay.
Which in Italian we would say compare,
Uh-huh.
meaning a close friend. But
Right.
I think that you linked it to the Italian comare, which is the female version. Compare will be the male version.
Okay.
And I don't know. Well, this is a great question for you. I don't know if Goomba is used for women as well here in the States.
Yeah, actually, when you say that, like, hey, he has a gombade, that means a mistress.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you see, compare in Italian is actually just for men. So, well, that's eye-opening. Yeah. And another word that I noted here is sporcaccione, which you translated as pain in the neck. I'm cleaning up the language here because this is going to go on YouTube. But sporcaccione, so you translated it as pain in the neck. Maybe that's how it's used here in the US. And but for me, like if I'm thinking about someone, my grandparents used to call this guy or that guy a sporcaccione. It comes from sporco, being dirty, and refers to being dirty like sexually. Like someone who has a kink or who is constantly thinking about sex or sexualizes people, like that type of person. So that's what I associate it to. But it's used differently here in the States.
Yeah, it is. And that's the funny thing too, is that when you think about the difference between Italian language, true Italian language, and the way we use words, they've so evolved, and it's the one I get a kick out of is gabagool. You ever hear gabagool?
Meaning capocollo, I think.
Yeah, it's like how the heck? Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Isn't that something that you eat?
Yeah,
right?
capicola.
Okay, okay.
See, now you say capicola. I say capicola.
Capocollo. So it's like capo means head and collo
Right.
is neck. So capocollo is that part of the
Right around the neck. Yeah.
cow. Is that a cow?
No, it's pig.
It's
Pork.
pig. It's pig.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. But
So is
yeah,
that part of the pig, right?
yeah. And it's usually spicy.
See.
I love it. I love how capicola turned into gabagool. I'll never know.
It's dialect, right? As you clearly pointed out in your book, the majority of Italians who immigrated to the US came here before Mussolini rise to power. So before the Italian language was actually used and learned in school, they spoke their regional dialects, and oftentimes coming from the south of Italy, you have that tendency of chopping off final vowels, or the C becoming a G, almost like in sound.
Frankly, I think the Italian language is beautiful. And I mentioned in the book that I did an experiment with some people, and they're all Americans. And what I would say to them, I play someone talking, and I'd say, "What language do you think that is?" They go, "Well, that's Italian." And it wasn't. What it was it was J.R.R. Tolkien reading poetry in the language of elves that he had made up. Now, Tolkien was a linguist. Tolkien spent his life studying language, and he created this language. All the languages he created in Lord of the Rings was to reflect the nature of the people. And the language he created for the elves were supposed to be like angelic. And it just goes to show that the Italian language, I think, is angelic.
Before we dive into this, because I know that the two of us could talk about languages forever, but there is one question that I just wanted to put out there.
Sure.
I'm curious about why and how you find yourself writing Italianità. Like, what moved you to do it?
My own ignorance. Seriously. When I was a kid growing up, I grew up in an Italian-American neighborhood. And it's like a fish in water. A fish doesn't know it's in water. A fish just thinks it's a fish in its own little world. And that's how my neighborhood was. It was an Italian-American neighborhood, and we just had this culture that we lived in. As a kid growing up, Italy was this mythical place to us. My father always wanted to go to Italy, but he died before he could go. And like Italy to me, in my mind, was like scenes out of the first Godfather. And I always wanted to go. And I was always talking, someday I'm going to go to Italy. Someday I'm going to go to Italy. Someday I'm going to go to Italy. And I have this nephew, and I'm talking about it. And he goes, "Will you just go and shut the hell up about it? All you do is talk about it. Go." And we go to Italy. And as any Italian, I'm sure knows, that I was the typical Italian American. And it's like, oh, I knew everything. I mean, everybody there was going to be just like me. I mean, when I landed in Italy, it was going to be Giovinazzo. Oh, you're my long lost cousin. Oh, welcome back. Oh, and when we landed, I remember all four of us. My two kids were with us. It was like we all cheered, "Eureka! I found it! Eureka! We're here in Italy." And the Italians are like trying to get by, and they're getting bugged with us and stuff like that. And I'm acting like a real Italian American stereotype. I start to notice more and more, and I start to realize that, boy, it's very different here, and Italians are very different than Italian Americans. So I started really trying to discover Italian culture, and I started to discover how very different Italians and Italian Americans are. So I celebrate being Italian American, and that culture is very different from Italian culture. But yeah, so we were very different in our eating habits. We're very different in our behavior. And I think a lot of it comes from the fact that the majority of us came, 100, 140 years ago, the majority of us came between 1880 and 1920 is when the majority of Italians immigrated to the United States. And I think a lot of it comes from the fact that we were Southern, we were, the contadini, and, we weren't like people from the North who are significantly, or were significantly different. I mean, we were working class, and we were in a society where people really looked down on us, and we really had to fight to have some sort of equality. So I think you'll see a lot of the crassness there. I think a lot of it comes from the idea that you'll see, you can't say negative things about a lot of ethnic groups, except Italians. I mean, if you watch American television, they're always making fun of the Italians. You'll see a lot of Italian stereotypes, a lot of mocking of Italians. And I think a lot of it comes from the reason why it continues is because Italian Americans won't let you know that you're getting to them.
I was just wondering, do you think that this is also because Italian and Italian Americans, Italian who immigrated here, embraced the stereotypes to try and be accepted? They started making fun of themselves to try and instead of pushing back.
I think that you make a really good point, but I would say it slightly differently. My grandparents' generation, not so much. My grandparents' generation, the Italian government sponsored schools in the United States to continue Italian culture, so that Italian kids growing up, or the children of immigrants growing up in the States, wouldn't lose their identity. And my parents spoke Italian, but they didn't teach it to us, because when World War II came along, there was an active suppression of Italian culture on the part of the American government. They went around posting signs in Italian neighborhoods, "Don't speak the language of the enemy," and our culture was suppressed. And I think a lot of Italian Americans were lost in what it really meant to be Italian. And they don't know the language, they don't know the history, they don't know our food. A lot of these stereotypes persist because, like I said earlier, they don't know who they are, but then they're told who they are, and it's like, oh, okay, so I'm supposed to call it gravy and not sauce. Okay, so then it becomes like, vehement. People will grasp onto things that become a stereotype. Like I said, I didn't know for much of my life what it meant to be Italian, and I would act the Italian American stereotype. They continue because they don't know. They just don't understand what true Italian culture is.
Mm-hmm. So they are given a role to play, to perform. That's what they do without questioning it, without discussing it. And then to someone who's coming straight from Italy, it looks so weird and so bizarre. But in a sense, it is peculiar to see so many Italian Americans performing the same role across the board. While in Italy, it's different. It's difficult to define Italians in one way. Because Italians are so many different things. So it really depends on your personality and your gender and your age and where you were born and where you grew up. While in the United States, then you see those Italian Americans being a bit of the same thing, like mini replicas of a bunch of different characters that you mentioned in the book. Some of them I was familiar with, some others were completely new. Who are Gina and Guido? Why?
Gina and Guido. It's interesting because the National Italian American Foundation did a whole symposium on that. But the Guido really rose out of Saturday Night Fever. In fact, the character on Saturday Night Fever was made up. That the author, the whole thing started when there was this reporter who wanted to report on the social scene in like Jersey, in New York and Jersey, in the disco scene. and he couldn't find anything to really report on. So he made up these people and these caricatures, and he wrote an article as if it were true. And then this caught on, and then it was made into the movie Saturday Night Fever. And the next thing you know, all these Italian kids are walking around with their shirts open and the gold chains and things like that. And then and that's where it all came from. And it continued to this day. And a lot of, as I described in the book, there were a lot of economic forces that played into that as well. Because when I was a kid, or the generation before mine, my elder brother's generation, Italian kids were typically what they called greasers, the mechanics, and they'd have their sleeve rolled up with a cigarette pack in the sleeve. And I mean, there was a kid in my neighborhood who was exactly like that. I'll never forget this kid. But he always had grease under his fingernails. But that was the previous generation. But then as things loosened up morally in the 60s, and kids started staying home more and those sorts of things, they had more disposable income. And so they started living out this whole lifestyle that eventually grew into the Guido. And that's what they thought was being cool.
And where does Gina come from?
Gina? Now Gina's a good thing, though. There's Guidos and Guidettes, but the opposite of a Guido is not a Gina. To me, Gina is a very positive thing. There used to be a cartoon, Dennis the Menace.
Yes.
And Dennis the Menace had an Italian playmate. There were two girls in his little circle of friends. There was Margaret, who was a pain in the neck, and then there was Gina, who was cool, and she was an Italian girl. And she was like a tomboy. But see, now when I think of Gina, I think of somebody like her. But actually, what I really do think of is, I think of an attractive young Italian woman. So Gina is a positive thing.
So Gina is attractive in a non-pretentious way, though, in a more natural way.
Yeah, in a natural way. Exactly. That's a great way of saying it. A non-pretentious way. She isn't overly sexualized. It's the girl next door, the Italian girl next door. That's a Gina to me.
Okay,
the Italian girl next door.
That is a positive stereotype. Yes, not like the Guidos and the Guidettes.
Yes, a Gina. I would like my son to marry a Gina.
So I remember from your book reading a bit about Gina, and then you referenced a commercial. It was like a Super Bowl commercial.
Oh.
Yeah, 2012. Now, I was curious. I was not in the States back then. So I was curious, what is this commercial about? What is it talking about? And I Googled it and I watched it. And I have to confess that I was so triggered by, first of all, she's super sexualized because that's what people do to try and sell cars right now. Right. They just put half-naked woman on it and we're all happy, apparently. So that was maybe a too sexualized image of a Gina compared to what you just told me. But what triggered me the most, and I can relate, I guess, I could relate for a split second to the minorities that do not feel represented, is the fact that she was not a real Italian actress or model. She was not Italian at all.
Really?
Her accent is so not Italian. I forgot if she's from Croatia, Albania. I forgot exactly where she's from originally, but she's not Italian. I could tell right away. And I was feeling so triggered. Couldn't they find an attractive Italian woman for the job?
See, now, you see, that's where your expertise and your authenticity as an Italian comes into play, because if I had known that, I wouldn't have chosen her. Need to find a better Gina. Maybe I should go back to Dennis the Menace's version.
Well, we didn't really talk much about Italianità and what it actually is. We covered a couple of aspects. We talked a lot about food, which is probably the most authentic Italian conversation we could have.
Yes.
We talked about the language. How would you recommend somebody who lost their roots, someone who is Italian American and wants to get back in touch with that Italianità? How would you recommend them to go about it?
The first thing is the language is extremely important. It's your gateway into Italy. In it's not the only way, but if you really want to capture the essence of being Italian, of Italian culture, learning and understanding the language is really important. And there's so many tools available. As I said earlier, when it comes to your particular podcast, I love it because it's more than just here's a word in English, here's a word in Italian, here's a sentence structure, here's how you conjugate a verb. This is the way people talk, this is the way people use the term. So starting with language, Italian literature is great. Like I said, there's tons of great Italian literature. Some of them, if you want to understand Italy today, some of the more modern stuff is very accessible. Elena Ferrante, if you don't like to read, you can watch the HBO series. Personally, my great passion is Dante. I mean, Dante it's almost as important to me as being Italian itself. I mean, Dante it's something that I read on a daily basis. When I get to the end of Paradiso, I go back and I start with Inferno again. I'm continually reading it. And
are you reading it in English or in Italian?
I read it in parallel.
Oh, yeah.
So I have a parallel text. On one page it's in Italian, on one page it's in English. So the literature is very important. Learning the history. I mean, and there's tons of fictionalized history. Putting in a plug for my daughter's book. There's The Woman in Red, where she wrote a fictionalized biography of Anita Garibaldi. She's now coming out with a book called Antoinette's Sister that talks about the Queen of the Two Sicilies, Marie Antoinette's sister. That was the Queen of, I forgot her name, but so there's tons of good Italian literature that you can learn about the country from. And going to Italy is a great way of learning, of experience it firsthand. Go there. I like to do it on a bike. I've cycled Italy. My first trip on a bike in Italy, we went from Venice to Pisa, and that was wonderful. I mean, that was just that. And the thing that I like about being on a bike is that you're going in places where the tourists don't go, and you're really experiencing the true Italy as opposed to, the tourist traps and being on a bus. My first trip was on a bus, and I didn't capture the essence of it. Cruises are the worst. Don't go on cruises, especially if your cruise goes to Venice. Stay away from cruises to Venice. I may have the entire cruise industry angry with me, but no, if you go on a bike, I remember there was one time my wife and I went around the lakes, and I remember we were riding through a vineyard. We were literally riding our bikes through a vineyard, and we get to a spot where there's a little turnoff, and we stopped to just rest for a minute. And there was this abbey, and along the abbey were these huge bronze reliefs of the Stations of the Cross that led up to the abbey. And on each side of each relief was a cypress tree. So there was a cypress tree, the bronze relief, a cypress tree. Then there'd be a space. So as you went up to the abbey, now this was on a little path that was not as wide as this room, and you would never see that if you went on a bus. And not only that, but there was, like, one time I stopped to get some water to refill our water bottles, and there were a bunch of old guys sitting around talking, and my wife and I were on a tandem, and they were kind of laughing about it. And so I stopped, and I was able to talk with them, and it was just, we had this really pleasant conversation. So if you can go to Italy, go to Italy. Try to avoid the tours. Italians, there's tons of Italians that speak English. You have no problem with getting around. Just go to Italy. Just go. And I mean, get a guidebook. There's tons of stuff to see no matter where you go. The food is wonderful. The food is cheap. Let me tell you, it's very, okay, it costs you something to get there on a flight. Okay, so it costs something. But once you get there, it's relatively inexpensive.
Can I share the story of my latest trip to Italy? 2 years, during the pandemic. So 2 years after I was able to see my parents last summer. And we are having, it's my mother, myself, and her partner. we're having a little aperitivo, a little happy hour time. We're going to have dinner. First of all, aperitivo in Italy is not just drinks. They bring you food with. You don't even have to ask. They're just bringing you a lot of stuff. And then, well, I wanted to pay. My mom said, forget about it. I haven't seen you in a while. You're taken care of. But I hear when she goes and pay, I hear the conversation, and the bartender owner of the place says, okay, so that's going to be 750 euros. And my mom is multiplying by 3, right? Okay. So giving her, no, 750 total.
Yeah.
3 drinks and so much food that we were not even sure we would have had dinner afterwards.
Yeah, that's what you said. That's the wonderful thing about Italy. So, going to Italy is just a wonderful experience to begin with, but it's such a great way to experience the culture, experience the history. One guy who I like, if I could put in a plug for him, is this guy, Rick Steves.
Yes.
Rick Steves does a great, 90% of his shows are on Italy. I mean, when you turn on Rick Steves, it's someplace else in Italy. Watch Rick Steves, gets one of his books, and you can go there and you can experience it. Watch Italian movies. I mean, there's some great Italian films. Italian films are a great way to reconnect. Speaking of things available to you, it being the 700th anniversary of Dante's death, for people interested in Dante, there's a thing going on called 100 Days of Dante. And look it up you could Google it. But what they do is they go through the Divine Comedy canto by canto. And they're with a nice explanation and things like that. So even if you don't read it, it's something where you can watch these videos and go through it. Right now, they're just about to finish the Inferno, but you can go back and pick up from there. But I think it's very important if you want to understand Italian culture, I think Dante is incredibly important. And it's fun. I mean, Dante, I think, is a really fun read. It's a very interesting read. It's not an easy read, but it's very interesting. So that's something else. So there's tons of books, tons of movies. If you can go. And if you can find an Italian restaurant where it's a real Italian cook, those are good ones too.
Can I ask you how now that you know way more than almost anyone else about Italian culture, how do you distinguish a real, authentic Italian place when you're talking about restaurants, for example? Because there are so many here in the States. How can people tell almost right away if that's the Italian place they want to stop at, if they want to have an authentic Italian experience?
It's what's on the menu. you can tell pretty easily when what's on the menu. If they have pineapple pizza, don't go. Walk away.
I have to confess that I'm very snob when it comes to pizza especially, because it's something that I only want to eat when it's really good and when it reminds me of home.
Yep.
So I never really tried the classic New York slice, and I don't know if you are going to unsubscribe after hearing this, but when I go out for pizza, I go out to Italian places. If I never tried them, and if none of my Italian friends ever tried them and vouch for them, I look at the ingredients list, right?
Yep.
If there is chicken, meatballs, pineapple, I mean, I don't even want to consider it. But if you see like those things, like putting heavy meat on pizza, that's not a thing that we do. And then I look at the list of vegetables, because Italians would put a lot of vegetables on their pizza. If you order something with verdure, it's not just like one slice of pepper and one zucchini. You can have so many different things. And so I kind of select them that way. But very rarely I will go out for pizza because I need to be sure that it's really good. Otherwise, I feel like crying.
Now you make it at home? Do you make it at home?
Sometimes I do. I do. And the weirdest thing that I do when it comes to pizza that Americans or Italian Americans will never conceive, I don't know if you ever heard of it, but in Italy you will find this, is pizza tonno e cipolle. So tuna, like canned tuna and onions.
Now, I've seen that in Italy, but I've never been brave enough to try it.
Oh, it's good. I mean, I love it. It reminds me of my, upbringing and the type of pizza that you will eat when you're really hungry because it's a lot of stuff. It's heavy.
Okay, when you
Yep.
come to California, you're gonna make pizza like that. My wife will make Berjol.
Oh, it's gonna be an amazing
Few
meal.
Aperol spreads, we'll be doing great.
I feel like we came full circle, like starting.
Oh, we're back to food.
We're back to food.
Well, you know what's funny? When I was doing research for the book, I thought, okay, I'm going to start surveying Italians. So I went onto Facebook and I went on all of these Italian American pages and I said, okay, tell me what being Italian means to you. And it was all family food, family food, family food. I think Italian food is so good though, because the Italians were so poor for so long. Mm-hmm. And so what they did was they took simple ingredients that nobody else wanted, like almonds and poppy seeds and things like that. And they figured out how to do wonderful food with it. That's what it is. It's very simple foods, very simple things that conquered the world. But there's so much more to it though than just, pasta and red sauce.
I just wanted to ask you, because we talked a lot about food, and I feel that that's an essential element of Italianità. The language and the food, if you were to ask me, well, I'm a language coach, so of course I'm going to put the language there, up there. And also because Italians, when they hear about Italian Americans referring to themselves as Italian, they're questioning, well, but you don't even speak the language. So the language seems to be like the starting point.
Right.
Being able to grasp that Italianità. The food is definitely a close second. I am still shocked when I hear of Italians or Italian Americans who don't like to cook. Like, what happened in your childhood?
That's...
Can you identify another element that is absolutely essential and you think that people might want to direct their attention to?
I really think the literature is extremely important. I really do. It captures, I mean, if you think about what constitutes a culture, the literature captures the values of a culture, and especially as you read it, like if you start with like Dante, and then you go on to the more modern authors until modern times. If you follow the literature through the history, then you'll get a better sense of the people. I keep on thinking of Elena Ferrante and her writings. You really capture a sense of what it means to be living in Naples in that era. So I think that the literature is very important. It's enjoyable too. So I think those three things I think are critical for understanding the culture. Something you had mentioned earlier is there is no one thing that is Italian. There is no one thing that you can really go, you're not Italian if you don't do this. I was mentioning that earlier. And you're right. There is no one thing that is Italian, except I think if you look at the food, if you look at the music, if you look at the literature, there's this idea of life. It's almost like an existentialist way of looking at life, in that it's like you savor it, where it's this love of life. And so when you talk about the family, when you talk about the food, when you talk about the music, this is all the things that make life worth the living. And it's an appreciation for that. To me, that's Italian.
It really resonates like truth to me. Yeah. And especially that moment, the concept of slowing down to enjoy life in whichever form. It could be food, and it could be opening a good book. It could be watching the sunset, sipping a drink with your loved ones. But that concept of slowing down to appreciate, it's definitely something that I can recognize Italians tend to do even when they live in big cities like Rome or Milan, and they tend to run around. The running around is not the same as the running around here in New York. But if we could only integrate, maybe even once a week, we can start with that, integrate that Italianità in our lives, where we're on a Sunday morning, say, we're setting the table and sitting down for breakfast. Can you believe
Yes.
that?
With the television off and the
Yes.
cell phones in another room.
Mhm.
Yes,
Having
absolutely.
conversations and just being this as a reminder also for myself, right? Who moved to New York. And when I go back to Italy, I notice the hiatus. I notice how my life is, you know, changing a bit, is not exactly the same as it was. And it's
Yep.
nice to go back. It's nice to have a book like yours as a real
Well, thank
reminder
you.
of how we can all afford to slow down a second and enjoy life.
Well, thank you. I'm so complimented that you enjoyed the book. I can't tell you how much that means to me. That means a huge amount to me. And I will correct the Gina thing. I'm making note of that.
I absolutely appreciate your work. And actually, let me ask you, how can we, like everyone who's watching this interview, how can we follow your work? Where can we find you? What are you up to?
Right now, the best place to find me is Italianità.blog, and it's a regular A. I don't have the accented A. So it's
Okay.
Italianità.blog. I try to post on a weekly basis. I do a lot about Dante because I have a passion for Dante, but there's a good number of blog posts there. I also write for La Gazzetta. So if you subscribe to La Gazzetta magazine, it's an online magazine that you can get, and I write for them pretty much monthly. And then I'm working on a new book, and I'll have to find an agent for that one. But I'm working on a new book right now whose working title is Sons of Dante. It's a it's a it's fiction, but it's about being an Italian American in upstate New York. So,
I'm looking forward to reading that one. Thank you so much for your time.
oh, thank you for inviting me. I so enjoyed this.
It was such a pleasure.
Okay, when you come to California, I want to try that pizza. We'll have your pizza and my wife's brajol, okay?
Perfetto. Sounds like a plan.
Okay, okay, sounds good to me. Thank you again so much.
Thank you.